We begin by thanking our sponsors. TALMUD TORAH sponsorships for the month. We thank the Daf Yomi Shiur for sponsoring all the shiurim of the month of Teves in memory of Mr. Milton Marder, Mordechai Dovid, Ben Rephael HaKohen, is the neshama have an aliyah. We also thank Shirley Elbaum Family for sponsoring all the shiurim, all the TALMUD TORAH for the month of Teves in commemoration of the yahrzeit of Shirley's husband, Gerald Elbaum, Yaakov Kopel, Ben R Avraham Menachem. We thank the sponsors of the Week of Learning, Paul and Kathy Pollack, in commemoration of the yahrzeit of Paul's sister Linda, Leah Shmuel. We also thank Ayal and Sara Steinberg in the zechus of refuah shelaimah for Shulamis Bas Susha and her continued health. Daf Yomi for today is sponsored by Chaim and Malky Wecker in commemoration of the first yahrzeit of Rita Bayuk, Risha Bas Aharon HaKohen, a member of Suburban for over 40 years. All the neshamas should have an aliyah, the families in neshama, and the chayalim should have a refuah shelaimah b'karev. Okay. Today's daf is daf Ayin Aleph. We're going to begin all the way at the top of daf Ayin Aleph, Amid Aleph. It's a brand new Mishnah. A new Mishnah, but again on the same theme and the same topic as the rest of this parak, which is when a girl becomes an arusa and she takes a neder, the halacha is that both her husband and her father have to be made for her nedarim. So she's in a bit of like an in-between stage, where she's not completely in her father's rishos, she's not completely in her father's domain, but she's not completely out of her father's domain. At the same time, she's not completely in her husband's domain and not completely out of her father's domain. So the halacha is she has to have both her father and her arus, the man that she's engaged to, be made for her nedarim. Now, when I say the word engaged, doesn't mean like we say today, which is engaged, which basically is just a verbal commitment that you plan to get married, like a letter of intent. Because nowadays, engagement just simply means two people agreed to marry each other. Engagement in this context means that they already did erusin, they already did the kedushin part of the marriage, and they're just waiting until the nisuin is going to take place. So the halacha here, Mishnah says, she made a neder, v'hi arusa, and she is arusa, and then niskarsha bo bayom. So she made this neder, and that very day that she made this neder, she got divorced. And we're using the term divorce because indeed it's a real divorce. It's not just a broken engagement, it's a divorce. Why? Because the erusin already happened. So Nadra, she made a neder v'hi arusa, while she's still in arusa, she did not do nisuin yet. And then niskar shabo bayom, that same day that she made that neder, she got divorced. And then that very same day that she made a neder, and she got divorced, nisar shabo bayom, she got engaged to a new guy. So she had things lined up pretty well over here. She had this guy that she was engaged to, she made this neder, maybe as a result of this neder, she got divorced. Now, she has another person who's ready to get married to her. She does kiddushin on that very same day. Afilu lemeya. Even if she did this 100 times. A very interesting day. Halacha is avia ubaylo ha'achron mefir nidareha. Her father and the last husband that she got engaged to has to be made for her nedarim. So quite a dramatic day. But the halacha is that whether the neder was made with the current husband, or the neder was made with a previous husband, the halacha is that both her father and her current husband have to be made for her nedarim. Now, I'll just point out that the Nemuki Yosef writes that all of this is talking about in past tense. It says nadra vihi. Doesn't mean, so this means it already happened. Why is this? Says the Nemuki Yosef, because there's a halacha which you learn in Mesechus Yevamos called havchana, which means that when a person gets married and then gets divorced or ends a marriage for whatever reason, and then there's a waiting period of 3 months between the end of the first marriage and the start of the second marriage. Now, here, clearly, there was no waiting period. It all happened in one day. Now, one can make the argument that this would only be relevant, the halacha of havchana, which means that you should be able to tell a difference, is only relevant if there's nisuin. Why is this? Because what's the point of the halacha of havchana? The halacha is that if there's a child that's born, you want to be able to tell what the paternity is. Who is the father of this child? So if she's married to two guys in one day, and then she has a baby 9 months later, you want to be able to know who the father is. So therefore we create a period of 3 months in between, 90 days in between. So like this, not going to have any suffix. Well, no, if the child is born early, we could still know who the father is. If the child is born after those 9 months pass, so then certainly you know who that it's a child, a product of the second man. Now, that would only be relevant if there are relations that can create a child. Now, during Erison, one might think that since during Erison, generally there is no bia happening. There is no relations that can create a child. So one might think that would be mutter. But again, I don't want to go into the whole sugya right now. This is the sugya that was addressed in Maseches Yevamos, that the way we paskin in Shulchan Aruch is that there's a low plug. In other words, even if you know that there's no chance that there's a child from the first husband, nevertheless, the halacha is if she's married to somebody, you still have to wait. But the halacha is, the Gemara in Yevamos explains also in Daf Lamed Vav, I think, that this is all a din lechatchila. She shouldn't get married. But b'diavad, if it happened, she got married. So in this case, it's talking about where maybe she didn't show up at her Rav's door to ask him to officiate at this marriage, but she just did it. So she got married, and then during this period of her engagement, she made a neder. Her husband said, you know what, I'm out, divorces her, and she says, no problem, I've got someone else lined up. And then this may have taken place a number of times in one day that she got divorced and remarried. The halacha of this Mishnah is that the last husband, the husband that she has right now, at the time, is the one who could be made for her Nedarim. And the chiddush of this is that even though the neder was made under a previous husband, nevertheless, the aros of now is the one who's made for the Nedarim. Now, obviously, this is talking about bo bayom. If you look at the Mishnah, the Mishnah uses a number of times. Nadra v'hiarusa and niskarsha bo bayom. She got divorced that day. And then nisarsa bo bayom. She gets engaged that day. It all has to happen in one day. Why? Because as we learned previously, that the word biyom shamo, it has to be on that day. So if it's going to wait, it's going to lapse into another day, then it's too late for the aros to nullify the neder. The Mishnah continues. Ze'aklal. Here's the rule. Kol shelo yatsa l'rishus atzma, and any time that she does not exit and go into her own rishus, which means that she either became a bogeres, or perhaps or her father died, or she became a nesua. If you look at the Ran on the side, he says shelo bagra, she did not become a bogeres, so she did not become a full adult. Lo nisis, she did not have nisuin, so she did not leave her father's rishus and go into her own space. The halacha is, Kol shelo yatzu l'rishus atzma sha'achas, any woman who does not go into her own rishus or into her own domain for one moment, avia ubaylo ha'achron mefirin nedarim, her father and her most recent, her current husband, are the ones who must be made for the nedarim. It's not an either or, it's both of them. Both of them are required to be made for the nedarim together. Who is it? It's her father and her current husband. Now, the Gemara begins, Minalan da'aros achron mefer nedarim shenir l'aros risha. How do we know that a subsequent husband can be mefer the nedarim, can nullify the nedarim that were made under a previous husband? Now, if you look at the Ran over here, it's important to note that this is not a typical question of minalan. And we're going to explain why very shortly, but generally speaking, the word when we find the word minalan in a Gemara, it's a Mishnah states a fact, and the Gemara analyzes that fact, and then asks a question that how do we know that this fact is true? In this case, what's happening is, we're going to see Shmuel's going to speak in just a minute, but essentially it's Shmuel giving an interpretation of the Mishnah, and then saying, how do I know that this is what the Mishnah means? And the way that we're going to be able to prove that is because the Ran actually addresses this, we'll see it very soon, that very soon, the Gemara says, Tanya kavase de Shmuel. The Gemara brings a brisa to back up Shmuel. Now, Shmuel didn't say anything. Shmuel just asked how we know this halacha. If you're going to bring a brisa to establish the fact that Shmuel is saying, and the fact is in the Mishnah, there's no advantage to bringing a brisa to back up a halacha that's written in a Mishnah. The fact that it's written in a Mishnah should suffice. I don't need to have a redundancy in a brisa to say, oh, now I know it's true. It's going to be true by virtue of the fact that it's written in the Mishnah. And if the Mishnah is not enough, a brisa is not going to be enough. So the Ran's going to explain. I'll take you to the Ran. It is after the Gemara. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, about 8 lines into the Ran. And the Ran explains that Afilu Hachi, Shmuel Kibla Meirabo. Shmuel had a Kabbalah from his Rebbeim. Dechitana bo bayom mishum shmias aros tanale. In other words, he's addressing the point that it had to do with the fact that the aros heard the neder. And he explains, Mishum hachi amar minahani mili. That's why it says minahani mili. And he explains, Tahai minahani mili, these words minahani mili, lav hashas ka'amar le. It's not the author of the Talmud, of the Shas, who's saying this. Ela kula midivrei Shmuel. It's all Shmuel speaking. Uki'ilu amar hachi. It's as if it says the following. So, I would put quotations over the next line, which is Amar Shmuel. In other words, it's as if the Gemara says the following. Amar Shmuel. Shmuel says, Minani mili. How do I know this fact? The aros achron, that the subsequent aros, or the current, the last aros, mefer nedarim, can be made for a neder, can nullify a vow, shenir ularishon, that already appeared to the first husband. In other words, that the neder was made, the father knew about it, the first husband knew about it, the first husband bailed, and then she got a new one. How do I know that the second husband, or the third husband, or the 15th husband, or the 100th husband can then be made for that neder? So the Gemara answers, Amar Shmuel, Amar Kra, the pasuk says, V'im hayo tihiyeh leish unidareha aleha. There's a double lashon. There's a redundancy in the pasuk. If she will be to a man, unidareha aleha. The Gemara explains, Nedarim shahayu aleha kvar. This refers to Nedarim that she already had on her before she got married, before she actually came into the rishus of the aros. So the Gemara says, hold on a second. That fact we already established earlier in this parak, that her husband can be mefer, can nullify vows that she took before she actually got married. Dilma, maybe, hani mili shlo niru la'aris risha. Maybe that is only talking about cases when the first aros, the first husband, had no idea that those nedarim existed. Alva nedarim shniru la'aris rishon. Maybe once the first husband already knows about the neder, and he chooses not to be made for those nedarim, maybe lo matzi made for aros achron. Maybe at that point in time it's too late for the second husband to be made for it. The Gemara says aleha. The word aleha in the pasuk is an extra word, and kra yiserahu. So therefore, that extra word aleha includes nedarim that not only did she have on herself before she got married, but they are nedarim that were made, and her first husband became aware of them, and he wasn't made for them. Still, a subsequent husband could be made for those nedarim. Why is the word aleha extra? Because at the end of the pasuk it says asher asra al nafsha. So why do you have to have the word aleha? That extra word aleha tells you that any neder that is on her, whether it's a neder that she came in without her husband knowing about it, or her previous husband did know about it, a subsequent husband that came into the picture on that very day, halacha is he can and must be the one to nullify those vows together with her husband. Now, again, just to see where the Ran makes this point, if you go to the first wide line of the Ran, we're going to see that this next Gemara says, Tanya kavasei de Shmuel. That's what we're studying right now. Now, the Ran says in the first wide line, V'shmaita nami mukha de dina gufei de Shmuel, gufei Shmuel hu de ka'amar. The actual brisa itself seems to indicate that. Why? V'lav raya de krabel. It's not just a raya of the pasuk. Dim isa de dina de masnisanhu. If you're telling me that this Mishnah really is the implication of the Mishnah, u'shmuel lo amar midi. Shmuel's not saying anything. El demuchach lemikra. Rather, he's just the one referencing the pasuk. Heichi maisi tani kavasei de Shmuel. How can you bring a brisa to back up the halacha of Shmuel? Mi brisa denied hamurasa. From this case that we're going to mention in just a minute. If this Mishnah, this halacha comes straight from our Mishnah, my ulme de brayse must nissen. What's the advantage of having a brayse to tell you halacha more than the actual Mishnah? It must be, it's because Shmuel himself interpreted that this Mishnah is talking about a case where the aros understood. In other words, it's talking about the fact that it's focusing on the aros, not on the husband. Gemara says, Tanya Kavasi de Shmuel. We have a brisa which works together with Shmuel. Naira Murasa. A Naira Murasa, the halacha is Avia Ubaila Mefirin Dara. So that we've seen this before. Naira Murasa, a girl who has Erison, both her father and her husband are the ones to be made for her Nedarim. Ketzad, what's the case? Shama Avia, her father heard about this neder. V'hafer la, and he said, no, I'm sorry. I'm taking away this neder. You can't make this neder. Now, v'lo hispik habal l'shmoa, the husband, her aros, did not get a chance to hear about this neder ad shemes until he died. In other words, he died before he heard about it. V'nisar sabo bayom. Again, she moves quickly. She made a neder. On that same day, her husband died. She quickly married a new guy. Afilu me'apamit. Even 100 times this happened. Avia ubayla ha'achro mefirin nedarah. Her father and her last husband could be made for a nedarim. Now, how about the other way around? Shama baila, her husband, in this case, her husband heard about it first. V'hafarla, he did his job. He was made for the neder. He said, no, sorry, we're not doing that. Now, v'lo hispik ha'av l'shmoa, the father did not have a chance to hear about the neder, ad shemes habal, until the husband died. So again, in both cases, it's the husband who dies. It's just a matter of the order of what happened in terms of the nullification of the vow. In case number one, the father hears about it first, he's made for the neder, and then the husband dies. In case number two, the husband hears about it, he nullifies it before the father hears about it. After he nullifies the vow, what happens is, he dies, and now the father hears about it. So in that case, the father did not have a chance to hear about it until the husband dies. The halach is, chozer ha'av u'mefer chelko shel bal. The father now has to go ahead and be made for his part, along with the part of the husband. In other words, the husband and his hafara disappear. Now the father has to go ahead and do the full job of being made for the entire neder, his part and the husband's part. Now let's just see for a second what happens here in the Ran. There's a very important Ran where he's analyzing Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai. We'll quickly see Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai before we see it, but this has come up already, this Masechta, the concept of Miklash Kalish, or Megas Gayis. Just to quickly remind ourselves, there's, I guess, two ways of understanding what happens when two people are required to be made for a neder. Do you say that when the husband or the father does it, when one of them do it, the first hafara really is just like the first blow on the neder, and it takes away some of its steam, but it's fully intact. In other words, the neder is still here, and it just has been weakened by the fact that one of the relevant parties went ahead and did the hafara? Or do we say that one whole half of the neder has been destroyed? I guess you kind of think of it as like a massive door to a room, and you have two people who have a bulldozer that they're using to knock the door down. Do you say that the first strike kind of loosens the door, and now it just needs one more strike from the second bulldozer and the door will come down? Or do you say the first bulldozer knocks down half the door? Now you still have a fully intact door on the second side, and the second bulldozer knocks it down. So it's a matter of whether it got weakened or one half went away. Now what's the relevance to that? The relevance is that if it became, we're going to see that this whole idea of miklash kalash, if it became weak, so then the concept of nisrokna, where you're going to pass it from one person to the next, it's not chashiv enough to transfer. A neder that has become weakened can no longer be transferred. And that's the idea of miklash kalash versus megas gayas. If megas gayas means I cut off half the piece, but the second piece is fully intact. So if the second piece is fully intact, it's still a chashiv, a thing. I could transfer it from one person to the next. But if the whole thing has become weakened, that's not transferable. That loses its ability to be transferred. So now let's see how this plays out over here. The Gemara says, Amar of Nasin, the second half of this brisa, which said that if the husband did his job of being made for his part, then died before the father has the opportunity to do it, then the father can go ahead and be made for his part in the second part. Hein divrei Beis Shammai. That only works according to Beis Shammai. Avol Beis Hillel omrim ein yachal lahafer. The Beis Hillel is going to say the father can no longer be made for it. Why? But my pligi. What is the subject that they're arguing about? Beis Shammai Savri. Beis Shammai says Nedarim nami sharoi la'aris, a neder which had become known or appeared to the original aris, nisrokna rishus la'av, he can clear out his space and give it to the father. Umegiz gayis, because you really cut off a piece. In other words, the husband cut off a piece, and now whatever transfers to the father. Beis Hillel Savri, avio baila ha'achron mefir nederevelo megiz gayis. You have to have the father and the second husband to go ahead and be made for the second half. Velo megiz gayis, it's not going to cut off a piece, rather it just becomes weak. So now let's go back to this Ran for a second. The Ran is in Dibra Maskal Vio Baila Ha'achron Mefir Nederevelo, and he starts off quoting Pirshuk Tzas Rishonim. So it's about a third of the way down in the very wide lines. He says Pirshuk Tzas Rishonim. Some of the Rishonim have explained the Hach Bava Kamaisa. This first gate, in other words, in this brisa we quoted two cases. Both of them had to do with when she makes a neder and she's narusa. In the first case, what happened was the father did his job at being made for it. The husband never did his job. He just passed away before he had a chance to do it. So the question is, in that part of the brisa, would Beis Hillel agree? In other words, the Hach Bava Kamaisa Divriya Kalhi. Some Rishonim would say this works according to everybody. The pluk to the Beis Shammai Beis Hillel beidach Bava Bilchudi. The disagreement between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, whether the concept of weakening the neder or cutting the neder in half, is only in the second case where the husband did the hafara first. It says the Rabbi Tmihani. I have been very stunned by this. Beis Hillel desavri lu miklash kalash. According to Beis Hillel, who says the mechanics of a two-person hafara work, if the first person does it, it just becomes weaker. Kivin neshama avia v'haferla, says the Ran, once the father hears about it and he does his hafara, the iklish lay, and now the neder becomes very weak. The iklish lay haynidra dakati isalaav v'lo batlala hafara delay hechi matzu av aras achron lahafer. He wants to know, how could it be, according to Beis Hillel, who says that the mechanics are that the neder becomes weak, if the father went ahead and was matir his half of the neder and weakened it, how can it now work that he could work together with the second husband? He explains. The Amar Beis Hillel, by Hillel, Beis Hillel explained earlier, to Shama Avia V'Hafarla, the father heard about a neder and he nullified it. The husband did not have time to even hear about it until he died. The halacha is the Einav Yachal Lahafer. The father cannot go ahead and nullify it. In other words, it's very clear in Daf Samachtas that if a woman is engaged, she has erison with her husband, and she makes a neder, her father nullifies his half, and then her husband dies. So the halacha is the father cannot now go ahead and be made for the chelik of the dead husband. So how can it be that this first half will work according to Beis Hillel? And he explains the Ran. We'll just skip a couple words. V'nira be'enai lefi divrei zal dahainu taima. This is the way it works. This is the reason. Mishum dila'el, earlier we're talking about a case to ikash shino rishos. There is a transfer completely back to her husband, to her father. The mintik lehai nidara me'aros la'av. We are transferring the neder, we're emptying out the husband from this case and transferring the whole thing to the father. So kohecha de kaloshle lo matzi mintik. Anytime the neders become weak, it can't be transferred. Aval hacha, the ika aros achron. We're not talking about a case where the aros disappeared and the father is now gathering together the entire power of the neder in his own. Rather, we're talking about the Ika Aros Achron. There is a second guy here. There's a new Aros who took the place of the first Aros. Chazina le'lahai Aros Achron kekare de Risha. We see the second Aros like the leg of the first Aros. In other words, he just steps into his shoes. The Kivan, to me Aros the Aros Kaasi. Since it's transferring from one Aros to the next, Afal Gavd Iklishle Nidara Matzi Avu Baal Lahafer Chiagavna Lav Intukehu. So explains the Ran something very important. It's true that if a woman has a husband and a father who are relevant in her life, she is a Naira and she is Mu'urasa. So she has an Aros and her father who are relevant in her life. If the Aros dies without being made for the neder, and there's no new Aros in the picture, the father cannot be made for the neder, because that weak neder cannot be transferred back to her father. However, if a new Aros moves into the picture, he can very easily just slide in and be the guy who's going to be made for the neder. Now, even though he wasn't there at the time, nevertheless, he is kikare de Aros. It's a similar expression of bra kara de avua. Like his son, with regard to Yerusha, he just moves into his father's position. The same thing is true over here. The Aros, the second Aros, is really, he just like the leg of the first Aros, and he steps right into his shoes, and he's able to be made for the neder. So therefore, it can be that the first half works both according to Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai. The second part is where it's going to get complicated. The second half, which is Shama Baila V'Haferla, where the husband heard about it, and he was made for it, then he died. So then it becomes a question, can such a neder be transferred to the next or not? But ultimately, what happens over here? We have a raya from Beis Hillel. Let's just go read this again. Aval Beis Hillel, Amrim Ein Yachal Lahafer, my pligi. Beis Shammai Savri, Beis Shammai holds, Nedarim Nami Sharai La'aros, or probably should say Sheniru La'aros. Yeah, if you look at the Bach. Beis Shammai Savri, Nedarim Nami Sheniru La'aros. Nedarim, also which have appeared before the original Aros, Nisrokna Rishus La'av, they get transferred to the Rishus of the father, Umegas Gaius. In other words, the first part is cut off. Beis Hillel Savri, Aviu Baila Achel Mefira Nedarev Lo Umegas Gaius. You see clearly from Beis Hillel that the father and who? The subsequent Aros is the one who's made for the Nedarim. So here we have a clear brisa according to Beis Hillel that it can be a subsequent Aros who is the one who's made for the Nedarim together with the father. So that's the raya to Shmuel, that even though the Nedarim appear to the first Aros, still the halacha is that a subsequent Aros could be the one to be made for those Nedarim. Now, there's a lot of Ran here on this page. We're not going to learn all the Ran, but I think it's just important. I think this has been spoken out previously by the Rav, and we pretty much mentioned it here as well. But the Ran does give a pretty clear explanation of what happens and how the mechanics of this work over here. I would encourage you to look at the Ran in the second very wide line in the words V'nira li. He's explaining how this works with Megas Gaius and Miklash Kalash. So let's see this together. V'nira li. Tahainu Taima. This is the reason. Mishum de Beis Shammai desvira lahu Megas Gaius. According to Beis Shammai, who holds that the mechanics of how a neder becomes nullified with joint hafara of the husband and the father, he holds it works with the mechanics of Megas Gaius. In other words, cutting off a piece. Kivan de chihafer Baal. Since when her husband is made for the neder, what happens is ivatel le palga de nidr legamri. So the husband's half of the neder becomes completely cut off. Hare ma'isa shelo nigmar. His job is done. V'istalek le aros legamri. The aros is completely removed. Unihi, and it's true and granted the chimes aros batla hafara delay. It's true that when he dies, his hafara is buried together with him. Miu mikivin distalek le aros mehacha v'sulo chazi nidra aros klal kam le'av below aros. The father's left by himself. In other words, the aros is relevant as long as he's an aros. According to Beis Shammai, what happens? She makes a neder when there's a father and an aros in the picture. And then the halacha is you have to have father do it and aros do it. According to Beis Shammai, when the aros does his hafara, he cuts off a huge piece. Now, when he dies, that hafara goes away. But guess what? He goes away too. So he becomes irrelevant. And therefore the father takes over the whole thing. He can be made for it on his own. If there's no aros, the father does it himself. We compare, this was yesterday's Amud, the Nedarim which preceded her marriage to the ones which precede the second marriage. In this case, the Le'el, the Shama Avia V'Hafrala, Afilu Amra, Afilu Amrit, Lamanda Amra Megiz Gai is a Stalik Le'av, even according to one who says Megiz Gai is a Stalik Le'av that the father left, Filachi Kimes, when the guy dies, Batlo Le Hafara delay, his Hafara goes away, V'Kam Le Aros the Chudei, below Av, below Matzi Mefer. So in other words, if we go the other way around, if the father dies, the Aros is stuck without the father. And can't be made for it. Hainu Tamai the Beishamai, the Amri, the Av Matzi Mefer Hacha below Ars Achron. So in other words, the mechanics of Beis Shammai is, as we explained, it works with Megiz guys. He cuts off a piece, and if he dies, he loses his ability to be made for it, but you don't need him anymore. Beis Hillel Savri, Avio Baila Achron, her father and her second husband Mefer in a TORAH, they have to do it together. Why? The father can't do it by himself. Why? Mishum dulav megiz gayis. When the first husband was made for the neder, he doesn't cut off a piece. The kishahafer baal lo ishtako palga the neder. When the husband did his job of afara, we didn't take away after the neder. Ela kule nadrahu, the entire neder is still here. The iklish, it got weak. Viklishusa lav maisa gomer. Making something weak is not a real action. Mishum hachi lo chayil klau adam etztarfli klishus the idach. In other words, starting the hafara doesn't work. It doesn't do anything. You have to do it together with someone else. As long as the father doesn't do his job, the relevance of the baal, the husband's hafara, is still there. That's how the second husband takes over. In other words, simply spoken, if you hold that when the husband does his job, he cuts off a piece, so it's really he's done his job completely. And as much as he did his job completely, if he is irrelevant because he's gone, so then he's only worth as much as his relevance. If he's gone, and you don't need that far anymore. According to Beis Hillel, that it's miklash kalish, so then he gave a massive blow to the neder. But even though he gave a massive blow to the neder is still relevant. And therefore, now that he has to transfer it to somebody else, he still needs to have that second blow of the aros there to be relevant for the full hafara. And that's how it works according to Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. Now the Ran continues with a lot of discussion, but that's essentially how it works. The Gemara continues, Yibailu. The Gemara asks a question. Gerushin kishtika damya, o kakama damya. If a guy divorces his wife, how do we view that? How do we view a person who divorces his wife? So imagine the scenario. This lady makes a neder, her husband gives her the eyes, and then divorces her. So he doesn't say anything. Is it kihakama? Is it as if he was making her neder, and a neder which has a hakama, which has been upheld by the husband, is no longer eligible for hafara? Or is it kishtika, just like nothing? Well, my nafkamina, what's the difference? Gemara says, Kagon, Shenadra, she took a neder, V'shama baila. Her husband heard about it, V'gersha, and he divorced her. V'ahadra b'yomei, and he said, you know what, forget it. He went ahead and remarried her on that day. Okay, so she makes a neder, he gives her a divorce, and a few minutes later he says, you know what, Harayat Mukadashasli. He marries her back. You know, there's a famous joke. There's a guy who shows up to the Rav in the morning, and he says to the Rav, you know what, I've had it. I'm done. And he says, I would like to get divorced. The Rav says, okay. He officiates the divorce, and everything is finished. He wishes them a mazel tov, they're divorced. A little while later, guy shows back up with the same woman and says, Rabbi, would you like to officiate at our wedding? So the Rav says, I don't understand, I just divorced the two of you. So he says, for a zivug sheni, she's okay. So here, this is what happened. He marries this woman. During the marriage, she takes a neder. And then he says, you know what, out. He comes back that day. He says, you know what, as a zivug sheni, I could have a wife with these nedarim. So now, if you're going to say it's just like being quiet, so then, matzi meferla, he's able to go ahead and be made for it. Why? Because he just didn't do his job. In other words, while he was originally married to her, he had a job to be made for the neder. He didn't do it. So now it's still the same day. He is a new aros in the same woman's life, just like another random person could be made for the neder. He can do it. However, if it's as if he upheld the neder by being quiet and then divorcing her, so then lo matzi meferla, he can't go ahead and be made for it now. So there's a big difference. He says nothing and divorces her. How do you view the divorce? Do you view the divorce as, you know what? You made a neder. I can't be married to somebody with a neder. And he walks out. So that's like being making the neder. That's like upholding the neder. Or is it as if he just said nothing, he just didn't want to have anything to do with it, and now later when he gets married to her again, he made for the neder. We'll stop here for today and continue Risha tomorrow with a bunch of rayas to this case. I feel like we should